In the last video, we talked about using standard deviation to measure the total risk of an investment, such as investing in a stock. Total risk can be considered as a sum or a total of the so-called firm-specific risk and the market risk. What is the firm-specific risk? It is a risk that is specific to the company itself. For example, if we are thinking about Boeing, the company that makes airplanes, and you may remember recently there were some plane crashes that may be due to the design flaw. If that's the case, the product design failure could affect the stock price of Boeing, but it may not really affect the price of any other stocks in the stock market. So that is the firm-specific risk. It's also referred as diversifiable risk. If this risk is only associated with the company itself, for investors, we can actually reduce this risk by diversifying into other companies, other stocks. So for example, if we buy another stock from a company that's totally unrelated to Boeing or unaffected by Boeing's business, then my portfolio as a whole would not be too affected by Boeing's performance. So that's why we say firm-specific risk can be diversified away. The firm-specific risk is the diversifiable risk. However, we also need to be aware of the fact that as much as we can diversify, there are risks that will be applied to all securities in the same market. So this market risk is not diversifiable, or say cannot be diversified away. For example, if the U.S. economy is heading into a recession, and that would affect all the stocks in the market, not just one or two stocks. So that would be a risk that would apply to all the stocks in the U.S. market. In other words, no matter how much you diversify, there's a certain level of risk that's always there, and as long as you invest in the stock market, that part of the risk just cannot be eliminated. And that's what we call as the market risk. Here we use this graph to explain how diversification can help to reduce the risk to a certain degree. You see, when we have just one stock, such as the stock from Staples, the standard deviation of that one stock can be pretty high, almost 50% here. Then we add another company stock. So now we would have a portfolio of two stocks. The standard deviation of the portfolio now is brought down to about 40%. And as you introduce more and more stocks into this portfolio, you see the standard deviation for the whole portfolio is getting lower and lower. However, you also notice that it doesn't go down all the way to zero, which means the portfolio's risk, or say the standard deviation of the portfolio, cannot be totally eliminated. It will go down to about 18% here, and then it goes flat without going further down to zero. So the idea here is, as you introduce more and more stocks, portfolio risk will be lower. But because of the existence of the market risk, no matter how many stocks from the U.S. market that you add into your portfolio, the market risk will always be here, or say the market risk actually affects all the stocks in your portfolio, so that part just cannot be diversified away. So now when you have a well-diversified portfolio, your portfolio standard deviation is very low, but it can hardly go down all the way to zero. What we just described is actually the foundation of this modern portfolio theory. Again, the idea is when we combine securities, when we add more and more stocks, we have a well-diversified portfolio, then the risk is reduced. That's when you see very high risk, or say very high standard deviation, and going lower and lower. Under the modern portfolio theory, we want to find an optimum portfolio that can produce the highest return for the amount of risk taken. In other words, given the amount of risk, we want to maximize the return for the portfolio. Another thing about diversification that we need to understand is that diversification only works when you bring different stocks together. When you look at the two panels here, in panel A, you have two stocks, A and B. B is the one that's in the dotted orange line, and A is the one in the solid blue line. You do notice these two stocks, although the stock prices are not the same, they display same pattern, or say same movement all the time. You see when A goes up, B also goes up. And when A goes down at the same time, B would also go down. And then they would go up again and down again at the same time. When you have these two stocks and these two stocks only in this portfolio, so now your portfolio is in this dark solid line here, and you see this portfolio is like a replica of either stock A or stock B, same kind of pattern, same kind of movements. And there is no risk reduction in this portfolio because the risk, or say the volatility of the portfolio, is pretty much the same as the risk in stock A or the risk in stock B, because again, they are pretty much the same. This pattern between stock A and stock B here is what we call as perfect positive correlation. If you recall from your business statistics class, when you calculate the so-called correlation coefficient between stock A return and stock B return, the correlation coefficient will be 1, which means they are the so-called perfectly positively correlated to each other. That's just a fancy term to say they move in sync together. And now, if you look at panel B, when we have two different stocks together, you notice here when stock A in the blue curve goes down, at the same time stock C actually go up. And when stock C goes down in this dotted greenish curve, that's when stock A actually go up. So they can actually offset each other, or say they counteract with each other. And then when you put these two together, this portfolio seems more stable. So instead of having big up and down in stock C or in stock A, now you look at the portfolio, very small changes over time. So the up and down the volatilities is much smaller. So diversification helps to reduce the risk of a portfolio when you put two stocks that move differently over time. When you put these two stocks together, diversification works, or say the portfolio risk can be effectively lowered. The last thing we want to introduce in Chapter 9 is about the return of the portfolio. By now, you got the idea that we usually don't want to invest in just one stock. Instead, we want to have the benefit of diversification and have a well-diversified portfolio. And diversification works when we bring different stocks, or say stocks with different movement together. Now, when we do have a portfolio with different stocks, how do we calculate the return for the portfolio? It's a process of calculating the weighted average. So if we have a portfolio, and to calculate the portfolio return, RP, we look at the proportion of each different stocks in this portfolio. And for each different stocks, we multiply the proportion by that stock's return, and we add up across all the stocks in this same portfolio. So as you see, if W1 is the weight, or say the percentage of the first stock in the portfolio, W1 multiplied by R1, which is the return from the first stock. When we have another stock, we look at the portion, or say the weight of the second stock in the portfolio, and multiply by the return from the second stock. And we do this for all the stocks in this portfolio, and we sum them up. And all the W's, W1, W2 till Wn, all of them add together, we should have 100%, or say one whole portfolio. Again, as you see, this is a process of calculating the weighted average of returns across all the stocks in the portfolio, weighted by how much you invest in each stock. Here's an example to calculate the portfolio return. So if you have $6,000 invested in this News Corp stock, another $5,000 invested in First Data, and then $8,500 invested in Whirlpool, and you are also given the return of all the stocks in this portfolio. So the first one has a return of 8.24%, second one negative 2.59%, and the last one 10.13%. So what is the return for the whole portfolio? To calculate the return for the whole portfolio, we first figure out how much we invested in each stock. Or say, what is the weight of each stock in this portfolio? We sum up the value of all three stocks. The value of the total portfolio is about $19,500. Out of the $19,500, you invested $6,000 in the first stock, so the weight of the first stock is about 30% here. And the second one is $5,000. So $5,000 out of the total $19,500, that's a little bit over a quarter, 25.64%. The last one is about 43.59%. If you add up all the weights here, they should give you 100% or 1. So for the whole portfolio, the portfolio return is W1, 30.77%, multiplied by R1, the return from the first stock, W2 multiplied by R2, the return from the second stock. W3, which is from here, multiplied by R3. Since we only have the three stocks here, we do this for all the three stocks, and we sum up, and we get the average return for the whole portfolio, 6.29%. Again, it's an average among all the stocks, weighted by how much you invest in each stock. So that's it for chapter 9, and in this lecture we have tried to calculate the dollar return, percentage return based on the historical data. If you have the percentage return, you can calculate the average return, and you can also look at all the returns versus the average return and calculate the standard deviation of the returns. And then, based on the average return and the standard deviation, you can also calculate the coefficient of variation. We discussed that standard deviation helps us to understand the so-called total risk of a stock, while the coefficient of variation helps us to understand that per unit of the return, how much risk does the stock present. We also talk about diversification and how diversification can help us to reduce the risk of a portfolio, and how diversification works when you introduce different stocks, or say stocks with different patterns or movement together. We also talk about the limitation of diversification. You understand that diversification helps to reduce the risk, but it will be very hard or impossible to completely eliminate the risk of a portfolio, no matter how diversified your portfolio is, or say no matter how many different stocks you include in your portfolio. At the last part of the chapter, we also try to calculate the return for a portfolio based on the weighted average of the returns of all the stocks in the portfolio.